So we're sitting here admiring this marvelous piece by the wonderful Nan Goldin,
who might have had a very interesting upbringing, which explains a lot of her earlier works.
Some background information on Nan Goldin and how parts of her life and environment became a very inspirational aspect to her work. She was born in Washington, D.C., but grew up in Boston with a relatively liberal household when, unfortunately, the Goldin family dealt with the suicide of their eldest daughter, and this obviously took a great toll on the family, as you might imagine.
That's really terrible.
It really is.
Well, later on in Nan Goldin's life, she moved to New York, where she became very independent and became invested in her work. Her surroundings really had a great influence in her art and her views. She was surrounded in an environment that dealt a lot with, in that time period specifically, drug abuse and overdose, as well as violent and aggressive couples, AIDS, drag queens, basically really had a lot to do with love, domesticity, gender, and sexuality.
And you can really see that in this first piece here, which is entitled Jimmy Paulette and Taboo. In the bathroom, there is a series of these photographs that was all about the main subject in this photo. The series was called Jimmy Paulette and Taboo, and she was portrayed in various places in a domestic environment.
Right, and that's really what a lot of her work focused on, as we mentioned before. Not only does this domestic environment reference a little more to the feminine side of this male figure, kind of referring to the stereotypical female role in society, but also physically. I mean, the subject is wearing makeup.
This is where we really see the drag queen, gender, sexuality idea come into play. In this series in particular, Goldin really expresses the sexuality of drag queen lifestyle. These subjects are portrayed in a state that's not entirely transformed from male to female yet, because it's more of a process, and in the state between like all the makeup and all the dressing and hair is finished.
Right, and it's a process.
Yeah, it really is. And you can really see this sexual aspect and theme of drug abuse and sadomasochistic fantasies in an earlier series that Nan Goldin developed called The Ballad of Sexual Dependency. This series really focused on the idea of rough lifestyles lived by these particular subjects, and they weren't widely accepted or by any means understood during this time period, which was around the 1980s, but they resorted to various drugs and unfortunately had to deal with different diseases, one of them being AIDS, as mentioned so many times previously.
And these were dangerous lifestyles that these subjects lived, both inside and outside of their relationships. AIDS and drug abuse were both very serious, relevant threats to their lives during this time period, and even today, still. Goldin mentioned that most of these subjects lived short lives, and they didn't live much after this series was published in particular. This series was published around the 80s, and most didn't live past the 90s.
Whether it be by AIDS or drug overdose.
Right, and this wasn't the only subject matter that Nan Goldin focused on, but this was her earliest work that she is actually most well known for.
And later on in her life, she started focusing more on collaborative book projects, New York City skylines, landscapes, her lover named Shiovan. Yeah. And babies and parenthood and family lifestyles, and she's still going strong.
Just not as quite as bold in her subject matter as back in the 80s.